The requirement came through typed staff minutes. A road vehicle carried the weight burden, a gun carriage carried the recoil burden, a turret ring carried the rotation burden, a six-wheel frame carried the combined burden. The role required rapid redeployment on metalled roads. The role required long range without rail booking. The role required heavy fire for sudden contacts. Tracked hulls faced delays in shipment schedules. Tracked hulls consumed spares at higher rates. Road wheels aligned with better tyre supply projections. Road wheels matched wider workshop familiarity. A wheeled chassis simplified convoy speed control. A wheeled chassis reduced bridge classification uncertainty. A wheeled chassis reduced fuel cartage per mile. Paperwork described the concept as a compromise. Paperwork avoided grand claims of novelty. A six-wheeler provided axle load distribution. A six-wheeler provided more contact patches under load. So a six-wheeler provided redundancy after tyre damage. A three-axle layout limited ground pressure peaks. The three-axle layout limited frame bending at craters. Engineering notes treated recoil as the central risk. Engineering notes treated steering load as the second risk. Engineering notes treated ammunition stowage as the third risk. Drawings indicated acceptance of a high silhouette. Drawings indicated armour remained secondary to mobility. Workshop orders specified jigs for mount brackets. Workshop orders specified gauges for ring concentricity. Workshop orders specified torque checks for fasteners. The gun required a rigid cradle arrangement. The cradle required machined bearing surfaces. Bearing surfaces required controlled finish quality. Finish quality required extra lapping time. Lapping time required revised labour allocations. The chassis rails required reinforcement plates. Reinforcement plates required drilled hole patterns. Hole patterns required templates to avoid drift. And drift produced misalignment at the trunnion axis. Misalignment produced uneven recoil load paths. Uneven paths produced cracked weld toes. Cracked toes produced inspection rejections. Inspection rejections produced rework vouchers. Rework vouchers produced delayed acceptance stamps. The turret option raised weight beyond projection. The turret option raised ring friction during traverse. Traverse friction raised handwheel effort limits. Effort limits forced larger gear ratios. So gear ratios slowed target tracking on the move. On-move tracking was considered non-essential. The requirement favoured first-shot accuracy from halts. Halts reduced dispersion from chassis oscillation. Oscillation increased with cross-country steering corrections. Steering corrections increased with front axle loading. Front axle loading increased with forward gun placement. Forward placement improved recoil impulse distribution. Distribution still overloaded leaf springs in trials. And trials recorded spring set after repeated firing. Spring set altered ride height measurements. Ride height changes altered prop shaft angles. Angle changes increased universal joint wear. Wear reports triggered revised grease schedules. Grease schedules triggered new lubrication cards. Cards were stored in the vehicle logbook. Logbooks required serial entries by fitters. Fitters signed entries with pencil initials. Pencil entries later smeared under oil exposure. And a memo requested ink for critical inspections. Ink availability varied by depot stores. Stores issued ink with controlled requisitions. Controlled requisitions added delay to maintenance. The gun mount needed recoil stops. Stops needed hardened contact faces. Hardening required heat treatment capacity. Capacity competed with other ordnance parts. Ordnance parts carried priority codes on manifests. Priority codes shifted with operational demands. Operational demands changed before design closure. And design closure was recorded as provisional standard. Provisional standard still allowed minor bracket changes. Bracket changes required updated drill jigs. Jigs were made from plate and dowel pins. Dowel pins were reamed for repeatable location. Reaming quality depended on cutter sharpness. Cutter sharpness depended on supply of tool steel. Tool steel stocks were recorded on bin cards. Bin cards showed frequent substitutions in practice. Substitutions produced mixed hardness in fixtures. Mixed hardness produced burrs around guide holes. Burrs increased hole ovality across batches. Ovality forced oversized bolts in some repairs. Oversized bolts reduced available thread engagement. Thread engagement was checked with go gauges. Go gauges were issued under calibration schedules. Calibration schedules were sometimes missed during moves. Missed calibration raised dispute with inspectors. Inspectors wrote nonconformance notes in red. Red notes required countersignature by foreman. Foreman's signatures were logged in a ledger. Ledger entries included part numbers and quantities. Quantities varied across surviving notes. Records vary on completed vehicle numbers. The six-wheel drive arrangement required robust differentials. Differentials required hardened gears and accurate tooth profiles. Tooth profiles depended on hobbing machine condition. Machine condition depended on belt tension and alignment. Alignment checks used straightedges and feeler strips. Feeler strips were stored in cloth sleeves. Cloth sleeves absorbed grit from benches. Grit produced scratches on measuring faces. Scratches produced arguments over acceptable tolerance. Tolerance limits were set by drafting office tables. Tables were copied by hand into shop sheets. Copying errors were corrected with stamped amendments. Stamped amendments needed distribution to all lines. Distribution failed when packets went missing. Missing packets produced mixed configurations in assembly. Mixed configuration increased spares complexity and service. Service wanted commonality with existing wheel vehicles. Commonality influenced choice of tyre sizes. Tyre sizes were constrained by available rims. Rims were constrained by press tooling. Press tooling constrained wheel offset options. Offset options constrained steering scrub radius. Scrub radius constrained steering box load. Steering box load constrained driver effort at speed. Driver effort was measured during road trials. Road trials used marked distances and timed runs. Timed runs were entered onto trial record forms. Forms carried carbon duplicates for headquarters. Carbon duplicates produced faint numbers in archives. Faint numbers prevented confident speed statements. Surviving notes do not confirm top speed. The vehicle still aimed for convoy compatibility. Convoy compatibility made braking control critical. Braking systems required larger drums than baseline. Drum size increased unsprung weight on axles. An unsprung weight increased tyre heating on rough tracks. Tyre heating increased risk of tread separation. Separation risk produced revised pressure instructions. Pressure instructions were painted inside access panels. Paint stencils sometimes smeared over rivet heads. Smeared markings caused misreading under low light. Low light increased reliance on memory drills. Drills were issued as short printed pamphlets. Pamphlets were folded into map case pockets. Pocket storage wrinkled pages during wet weather. Wet weather blurred ink on cheap paper. Ammunition stowage competed with radio equipment stowage. Radio placement affected internal cable routing. Cable routing affected access to traverse mechanisms. Access issues produced redesigned inspection panels. Panels required latches with positive retention. Retention prevented rattles from firing vibration. Vibration loosened ordinary split pins over time. The time-based loosening was tracked on inspection sheets. Sheets had boxes for weekly torque checks. Torque checks used beam wrenches where available. Availability depended on workshop allocation lists. Allocation lists were updated by the quartermaster clerks. Clerks used stamps for issued and returned. Stamps required ink pads in good condition. Ink pads dried during long transport periods. Dried pads produced partial impressions on forms. Partial impressions caused rejection at audit. An audit rejection returned paperwork for restamping. Restamping consumed time without improving hardware. The gun required safe travel locking. Travel locking prevented bounce damage to trunnions. Trunnion protection prevented sight misalignment. Sight alignment required repeatable datum surfaces. Datum surfaces were scraped during fitting. Scraping produced curled swarf on bench trays. Swarf cut fingers during hurried handling. Handling injuries were logged as minor incidents. And incidents were filed under workshop safety registers. Registers listed causes sharp edges. Sharp edges were reduced by chamfering. Chamfering was inconsistent across subcontractors. Subcontractors worked with varying cutter profiles. Cutter profiles altered screwhead seating. Seating affected loosening under recoil impulse. Loosening was countered by locking plates. Locking plates required precise tab positions. Tab positions were formed with small press tools. Press tools wore rapidly under high volumes. Worn tools produced tabs that cracked during bending. Cracked tabs fell into the hull floor. Floor debris jammed pedal linkages in reports. Reports triggered directives for daily floor sweeps. Sweeps were added to crew routine orders. Routine orders specified broom and rag issue. Issue of brooms depended on local supply. Local supply competed with barracks requirements. The six-wheel chassis carried more grease points. The grease points required standard nipples and caps. Caps prevented dust ingress on dry roads. Dust ingress was severe in convoy columns. Dust abrades seals in rotating joints. Seal wear produced oil leaks at hubs. Hub leaks contaminated brake linings. Contaminated linings increased stopping distance. Stopping distance was evaluated on test tracks. Test track surfaces were not standardized everywhere. Surface variability confused comparative brake results. The comparative results were expressed as qualitative remarks. Remarks used terms like acceptable and marginal. Marginal findings forced further adjustment cycles. Adjustment cycles consumed scarce mechanic hours. Mechanic hours were planned in weekly rosters. Rosters changed when vehicles were reallocated. Reallocation required movement orders and fuel chits. Fuel chits were signed by unit transport officers. Officers cross-checked mileage against logbooks. Logbooks occasionally showed gaps from lost pencils. Lost pencils created blank mileage entries. Blank entries delayed authorization for spare parts. Spare parts requests used standardized demand forms. Forms listed part numbers and urgency codes. Urgency codes were questioned without clear defect reports. Defect reports needed description of symptoms. Symptoms included pulling and shudder and stiff traverse. Stiff traverse was linked to ring contamination. That contamination came from unsealed apertures during road marches. Road marches forced external stowage of tarpaulins. Tarpaulins were meant to cover openings in rain. Rainwater entered an emulsified lubricant. Emulsified lubricant reduced bearing film strength. Film loss in beschust galling under hand traverse. Galling required polishing of contact rings. Polishing removed protective coatings in places. Coating removal accelerated corrosion in storage. Storage was often outdoors under temporary cover. Temporary cover trapped moisture against metal. Moisture produced surface rust at fastener heads. Rust affected future disassembly during repairs. Repairs required heat application in some cases. Heat risks were noted near fuel lines. Fuel lines were rerouted away from hot zones. Rerouting required new clips and brackets. New brackets required additional drill operations. Additional drilling increased risk of swarf retention. Swarf retention caused shorts in electrical circuits. Circuits were protected by fuses of limited rating. Fuse ratings varied based on available stocks. Stock variation caused unpredictable fault behavior. Fault behavior was logged as intermittent failures. Intermittent failures were hardest to reproduce in trials. Trials demanded reproducible faults for corrective action. Corrective action relied on controlled test plans. Test plans specified firing counts per run. Run counts differed across surviving documentation. Surviving notes do not confirm firing totals. Still, recoil management dominated observations. Recoil transferred through the cradle into frame members. Frame members were boxed in stressed regions. Boxing increased weight and welding length. Welding length increased distortion risk. Distortion risk required post-weld straightening. Straightening required presses and heat. Heat straightening needed temperature crayons. Temperature crayons were sometimes substituted with judgment. Judgment produced disputes with inspection departments. Inspection departments demanded measurable criteria. Criteria included straightness over specified spans. Span values are not consistently recorded. Records vary on stated allowable deflection. The six-wheel arrangement allowed longer frame spans. Longer spans increased torsion on uneven ground. Torsion influenced gun alignment after cross-country travel. Alignment checks were done using bore sighting devices. Bore devices needed clean muzzle and chamber. Cleaning required issued rods and cloth patches. Patch supply depended on salvage and tailoring shops. Tailoring shops cut rags to specified widths. Width consistency mattered for tight bore passes. Tight passes removed fouling but risked sticking. Sticking rods caused minor delays before action. Delays were mitigated by keeping spare rods. Spare rods took space from ammunition lockers. Ammunition lockers were shaped around wheel arches. Wheel arches intruded into internal volume. Internal volume constraints drove rack designs. Racks used spring clips and separators. Separators prevented projectile nose damage during vibration. Vibration also damaged fuses in poorly packed stowage. Packing instructions were printed on small cards. Cards were attached with wire loops. Wire loops broke after repeated removal. Broken loops led to loose cards on floors. The loose cards created clutter during inspections. Inspections penalized clutter under safety policy. Safety policy was enforced unevenly by units. Uneven enforcement created inconsistent stowage standards. Standards were stabilized through later circulars. Circulars required acknowledgement signatures by commanders. Acknowledgements were filed and seldom consulted again. The gun itself required a firing platform choice. Platform choice considered open mount versus enclosed mount. Open mounts improve ventilation for propellant gases. Open mounts expose crew to weather and dust. Exposure increased cleaning load on optics. Optics cleaning used brushes and lens paper. Lens paper was scarce in some depots. Scarcity led to improvised cloth wiping. Cloth wiping caused scratches on coated lenses. Scratched lenses reduced clarity at distance. Distance engagement demanded accurate range estimation. Range estimation used sights and known landmarks. The landmarks were unreliable in featureless terrain. Terrain constraints pushed preference for direct fire. Direct fire required stable halt and brake set. Brake set procedures were written into drills. Drills specified engine idle or engine off. Engine off reduced vibration through the mount. Engine off reduced immediate mobility after firing. Mobility loss increased exposure to counterfire risk. Risk assessments existed as cautious language in notes. The notes avoided quantifying battlefield probabilities. They stressed short exposure times instead. Short times depended on fast loading cycles. Loading cycles depended on crew layout. Crew layout depended on internal passage width. Passage width was constrained by frame rails. Rails constrained by suspension mount points. Mount points constrained by axle articulation demands. Articulation demands differed between road and track use. Road use prioritized stability at speed. Their stability demanded anti-roll control through spring rates. Spring rates became a tuning parameter in trials. Trials swapped leaf packs for different thicknesses. Thickness selection was limited by stock sizes. Stock sizes were listed in supply catalogues. Catalogue listings lagged behind actual availability. Availability drove acceptance of suboptimal springing. Suboptimal springing produced nose dip under braking. Nose dip complicated sight picture during quick stops. And sight picture could be reacquired after settling. Settling time increased on softer spring packs. Harder packs increased shock loads on welds. Shock loads caused fatigue cracks in brackets. Brackets were inspected with dye in some shops. Dye testing availability varied by location. Location differences created uneven detection rates. Detection rates influenced reported reliability impressions. Impressions were summarized as serviceable with attention. Attention translated into daily checks and tightening. Tightening demanded access to buried bolts. Buried bolts required removable panels and tool reach. Tool reach required special spanners in some cases. Special spanners were issued in small kits. Kits were sometimes separated from vehicles. Separation occurred during depot transfers and reissue. Reissue introduced mismatch between kit and configuration. Mismatch forced improvisation with ordinary tools. And ordinary tools rounded fastener heads under strain. Rounded heads required cutting and replacement. Replacement required spare fasteners of correct grade. Correct grades were not always stocked forward. Forward stocks prioritized tires and fuel filters. Fuel filters clogged in dusty convoys. Clogging reduced power during reposition moves. Reduced power lengthened time on exposed roads. Road exposure prompted preference for night movement. Night movement increased accident rates in reports. Reports cited ditching and wheel rim damage. Rim damage required wheel changes at roadside. Roadside changes needed jacks rated for weight. Weight demanded wide base plates for soft verges. Base plates were made from timber offcuts. Offcuts varied in thickness and strength. Weak plates split under jack loads. Splits caused sudden drops and near misses. Near misses entered unit safety diaries. Safety diaries listed corrective actions as better plates. Their better plates were hard to standardize in field. Standardization attempts UZ issued steel plates. Issued plates added weight to stowage lists. Stowage lists already exceeded initial allocations. Allocations were revised through amendment sheets. Amendment sheets carried distribution marks and dates. Dates are inconsistent across surviving copies. The weapon demanded ammunition resupply planning. Resupply planning used tonnage tables and vehicle counts. And counts changed with attrition and reassignment. Attrition included mechanical write-offs after mines. Mine damage affected tyres and steering linkages. Steering linkages bent and jammed in cases. Jams prevented recovery towing without wheel alignment. Alignment in field required chains and leverage bars. Bars were not always on authorized equipment lists. Unauthorized tools were still used when necessary. Necessity was described in after-action maintenance notes. The notes recommended stronger steering arms in future. Future changes were limited by production tooling. Tooling changes required updated drawings and approvals. Approvals required multiple signatures and routing. Routing passed through offices with backlog queues. Backlogs grew when priorities shifted to other programs. Other programs pulled skilled machinists away. Machinist shortages reduced output of precision parts. Precision parts included ring gears and bearing races. Race quality controlled traverse smoothness. Smoothness controlled time to bring gun on bearing. Bearing time was measured by timed drills. Drills were recorded on training inspection sheets. Sheets included remarks about crew coordination. Coordination was treated as procedural, not personal. Procedure included defined calls and hand signals. Hand signals were used when engine noise dominated. Engine noise increased with high throttle repositioning. Repositioning was encouraged after firing bursts. Burst count guidance varied by local command. Local command issued typed orders with carbon copies. Copies were distributed and sometimes misfiled. Misfiling complicated later reference during investigations. Investigations occurred after accidental discharges. Accidental discharges were rare but documented. Documentation cited inadequate breach checks. Breach checks were added to drill cards. Drill cards were laminated in later issues. And lamination used thin film and heat sealing. Heat sealing sometimes warped small text lines. Warped text reduced legibility under torchlight. Torchlight was common during night servicing. Night servicing increased risk of missed cotter pins. Missed pins caused linkages to detach. Detached linkages immobilized vehicles unexpectedly. Unexpected immobilization triggered recovery requests. Recovery required tow bars with rated eyes. Rated eyes were forged and stamped. The stamp clarity sometimes suffered from worn dies. Worn dies produced ambiguous markings. Ambiguous markings caused hesitation during inspections. Hesitation delayed convoy departure times. Departure delays created traffic bunching on routes. Bunching increased dust concentration and wear. Wear cycles fed back into maintenance workload. Workload required rationing of workshop bay time. Bay time was allocated by priority lists. Priority lists favoured engine failures over optics issues. And optics issues reduced effectiveness but did not immobilize. Effectiveness calculations were not formalized in most notes. Notes focused on gun-ready status. Gun-ready status required ammunition present and secured. Secured ammunition required intact rack springs. Rack springs broke after repeated vibration. Breakage required replacement from small parts bins. Bins were often depleted of specialized springs. Depletion led to fabricated replacements from wire stock. Wire stock selection affected spring rate consistency. Inconsistent springs allowed rattling under movement. Rattling damaged projectile paint and markings. Markings mattered for ammunition identification. Identification errors risked wrong fusing selection. Selection procedures mandated two-person verification. Verification was sometimes skipped under time pressure. Time pressure was acknowledged in administrative language. Language avoided blame and requested retraining. Retraining used range days and supervised drills. Range days required allocated ammunition allowances. Allowances were controlled by higher headquarters. Headquarters requested returns showing expenditure and results. Returns were filed as monthly summaries. Summaries rarely included detailed dispersion data. Dispersion was hard to measure without instruments. Instruments were scarce outside dedicated schools. Schools produced instructors with standardized routines. Their routines emphasized mount inspection before firing. Inspection included checking traverse stops. Stops prevented overrun into stowed equipment. Equipment included radios, spare barrels, and tools. Tools were required for clearing stoppages. Stoppages occurred from dust in breech mechanisms. Dust protection used covers with snap fasteners. Fasteners tore free under brush contact. Brush contact occurred during off-road shortcuts. Shortcuts were used to avoid observed roads. Observed roads increased likelihood of indirect fire. Indirect fire produced fragment hazards for tires. Fragment hazards led to added spare wheel carriage. Spare wheel carriage further loaded rear axles. Rear axle load influenced bearing life. Bearing life was monitored by temperature checks. Temperature checks used hand contact in many reports. Hand contact was unreliable and discouraged later. Later guidance suggested simple thermometers when available. Availability again depended on supply chain condition. Supply chains used railheads and road legs. Road legs needed escorts and scheduling. Scheduling collided with fuel delivery priorities. Fuel delivery priority often trumped ammunition delivery. Ammunition delivery delays limited training mileage. Mileage limitation reduced detection of slow failures. Slow failures included frame crack propagation. Propagation was found near stress risers at holes. Holes were sometimes drilled without proper deburring. Deburring was skipped during rushed output periods. Rushed periods followed urgent operational signals. Signals were translated into production quotas. Quotas were posted on boards in workshops. Boards were updated with chalk figures. Chalk figures smudged under oily hands. Smudges produced confusion over targets. Confusion prompted clarifying memos from management. Management memos stressed inspection over speed. Head inspection still competed with delivery deadlines. Deadlines were linked to convoy shipping windows. Windows were set by port availability. Port availability fluctuated with air raid disruption. Disruption forced storage of completed hulls. Storage required protective greasing of bare metal. Greasing used heavy compounds applied with brushes. Brush bristles sometimes remained in grease layers. Bristles later contaminated bearing surfaces. Contamination required cleaning before acceptance. The cleaning consumed solvent and rags. Solvent was rationed due to other needs. Rationing forced use of steam cleaning occasionally. Steam cleaning risked trapped moisture in seams. Seams then rusted under paint layers. Paint systems were basic and production-driven. Production paint used spray or brush depending on shop. Brush marks indicated hurried application on some vehicles. Hurried application did not prevent service use. Service use depended on the gun meeting minimum function. The minimum function meant firing safely and moving reliably. Reliability was framed as maintainability in paperwork. Maintainability meant accessible parts and standard spares. Standard spares were limited for specialized mounts. Mount spares were often held at base workshops. Base workshops required transport requests and authorization. Authorization meant signatures and priority justification. Justification described operational need in concise terms. Concise terms avoided revealing sensitive dispositions. Disposition secrecy reduced detail in surviving records. Reduced detail increases uncertainty in technical specifics. Surviving notes do not confirm exact configurations. Still, the six-wheel concept persisted in use. Use persisted because road mobility stayed valuable. Road mobility allowed rapid concentration of fire. Fire concentration allowed temporary local superiority. Superiority claims were seldom written explicitly, but reports instead listed targets engaged and rounds fired. Targets engaged were described in generic categories. Generic categories preserved security and simplified returns. Returns were used to justify continued allocation. Allocation depended on demonstrating utility over alternatives. Alternatives included towed guns and tracked carriers. Towed guns required tractors and coupling time. Coupling time was recorded as a practical drawback. Tracked carriers required more fuel and heavier transport. Heavier transport required special trailers and planning. Planning demanded additional paperwork and escort resources. The wheeled gun avoided some of that burden. Burden reduction mattered in administrative decision cycles. Decision cycles were shaped by limited staff capacity. Capacity constraints favored solutions using existing chassis. Existing chassis benefited from established parts pipelines. Pipelines reduced stoppage duration after breakdowns. Breakdowns still occurred from axle overload and fatigue. Fatigue was mitigated by conservative driving orders. Driving orders limited speed on rough surfaces. Speed limits were posted on dashboard plates. Plates were stamped and riveted to panels. Rivets loosened under vibration in some cases. Loose plates rattled and obscured instrument readings. Instrument readings were needed for oil pressure monitoring. An oil pressure drops warned of engine wear. Engine wear increased under heavy vehicle mass. Mass increased with gun, mount, and ammunition. Ammunition load was sometimes reduced for long moves. Reduced load traded fire endurance for road range. Range trade-offs were planned by staff officers. Staff officers used route cards and distance tables. Tables were corrected when bridges were damaged. Bridge damage forced detours and increased fuel use. Fuel use increased maintenance of filters and pumps. Pump failure mobilized vehicles far from workshops. Immobilization required recovery and security escorts. Escorts increased manpower requirements for each move. Manpower constraints discouraged unnecessary redeployment. Redeployment was still demanded by evolving fronts. Front changes drove new tasking for mobile guns. Tasking orders specified firing positions and withdrawal routes. Routes were checked for turning radius constraints. Turning constraints were tighter with 3 axles. The 3 axles increased tyre scrub in tight turns. Scrub increased sidewall stress and heat. Heat contributed to blowouts during long marches. Blowouts were addressed with revised tyre inspections. Inspections included sidewall cuts and bead damage. Bead damage often came from curb strikes. Curb strikes increased during blackout driving. Blackout driving reduced spatial cues and speed judgment. Judgment errors were handled through driver training. This driver training emphasized gear selection and braking. Braking emphasis included downshifting for hill control. Hill control prevented brake fade from heat. Fade was more likely with heavier loads. Load weight remained the governing constraint throughout. That constraint shaped every memo about the vehicle. Memos rarely praised the design in language. Memos instead documented tolerances and corrective actions. Corrective actions accumulated as small iterative improvements. Improvements included stronger brackets and better seals. Seals reduced dust ingress to critical bearings. Bearing life improvements reduced workshop downtime. Downtime reduction improved availability metrics on returns. Returns supported continued acceptance of the compromise. Compromise status remained explicit in official phrasing. Official phrasing avoided calling it a universal solution. It filled a gap between gun and tank. The gap persisted when other equipment was scarce. Scarcity was the constant driver of acceptance. Acceptance was recorded by the stamps on inspection sheets. Sheets carried the final clerk signature and date. Date clarity is inconsistent across surviving sets. The vehicle then entered service as a tool. That tool required constant checking, tightening, and cleaning. That routine kept the gun mobile on roads. That routine kept heavy fire available at short notice. The 6-wheel layout supported the weight demand. The administrative system tolerated the ungainly silhouette. Function outweighed appearance in recorded decisions. Workshops kept it running through documented effort. Paperwork kept it issued through documented need.